A shard of ice, sharp and crystalline, seemed to scrape its way out from the very core of my being. That was the pain. Not a throb or an ache, but a fine glass-like fracture spreading across the expanse of my lungs with each faltering breath. I knew this feeling. It was the familiar, desolate sting that always arrived as death's quiet herald. Eleanor Vance, at 47 years old, was dying alone. The narrow cot beneath me offered no comfort, its thin mattress barely a barrier against the chill seeping from the corridor of the rundown county hospital. A bitter winter wind whistled through a gap in a window frame somewhere, a mournful sound that matched the hollow silence within me. In my hand, clenched in a grip that was fading with my strength, was a photograph. The edges were soft and worn from years of touch. It showed a boy of about 10, his smile a radiant, uncomplicated sunbeam that belonged to a different universe than this cold, antiseptic-smelling hell. My son Leo. Leo Vance. Outside the frame of that frozen moment, a single wasted tear traced a path through the lines on my cheek. It was not for the pain nor even for the dying. It was for the smile. For the boy who had given it freely to the world, but who, for the last decade, had withheld it from me. My ex-husband, David Vance, by this time had become the distinguished Colonel Vance. After our divorce, he had married Celia Thorne, a physiotherapist from the military hospital. She was the kind of woman who wore her patriotism like a fashionable scarf, who could quote military history and speak of duty and sacrifice in a voice that made it sound noble and clean, not something that grinded you into dust in a forgotten village. They lived in a spacious, sunlit apartment in the officer's compound, a world of polished floors and promising futures. And my Leo, my carefully guided, subtly steered Leo, had learned to be ashamed of the woman who bore him. To him I was Eleanor, the rustic relic, the embarrassing footnote from his father's early, less glossy life. The mother whose hands were calloused from soil and scrubbing, whose vocabulary didn't include the right jargon, whose very existence was a social misstep. My entire life unspooled in the dimming light, not as a tapestry but as a pathetic, threadbare joke. I had met David when we were both too young to know what we were choosing. He was ambitious, bright-eyed, determined to escape the confines of our rural county through the disciplined door of the military. I saw his drive and mistook it for depth. When he proposed, it felt like a ticket to a shared future. I had no idea I was signing on as the crew for his voyage, destined to be left on the shore when he reached grander ports. For his career, I gave up my acceptance to a teaching college. I stayed behind in Oak Ridge in the house that belonged to his family. I became the caretaker of his ailing, acerbic mother, Margaret Vance, of his 2 younger brothers who viewed manual labor as a personal insult, of the sprawling, demanding vegetable garden that was supposed to supplement his meager early stipend. My world shrank to the boundaries of that property, to the needs of his people. Every month I scrimped. I patched clothes until they were more patch than original fabric. I sold eggs and preserves. I took in mending for neighbors. And every cent I saved, every extra dollar I sent to David. For networking, he'd write. To stand tall with the other officers. I believed it. I believed my sacrifices in the quiet shadows were the foundation for his success in the bright light. I thought this economy of love, my investment, his return, was how marriage worked. The letter came when he was promoted to captain. The ink seemed to vibrate with his excitement. We could finally be together, he wrote. I could come to the base. Leo and I. A new life. I read those words clutching my chest, a sob of pure, years-delayed relief choking me. I had done it. The long vigil was over. The reward was at hand. I packed our few good things. I said tearful goodbyes to my own bewildered parents, who never understood why I worked myself to bone for a man who was never there. Leo, just 6, was a whirlwind of excitement about trains and soldiers and his father. The reality was a slap so profound it didn't even sting at first. It just numbed. The base was a bewildering labyrinth of concrete and shouted orders. David was different. Smoother, harder, his eyes scanning over me as if looking for something he couldn't find. The reunion was brief, awkward. He had meetings. He arranged for us to stay in temporary quarters. 2 days later, needing air, I took Leo for a walk. We found a small grove of birch trees behind the commissary. And there, in the dappled afternoon light, I saw them. David. And a woman with a sleek, dark bob, wearing a crisp, civilian dress. They weren't just talking. He was holding both her hands, his head bent toward hers in an attitude of intimate conversation. Then he laughed, a sound I rarely heard anymore, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek before kissing her. It was Celia Thorne. The name from his recent letters, the brilliant colleague. The world tipped on its axis. Leo, confused, asked, "Who's that lady with Daddy?" What followed was a blur of humiliating clarity. I confronted him, not with dignity, but with the raw, screaming hurt of a woman who has just seen the blueprint of her betrayal. I was the madwoman, the hysteric from the backwoods. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me with a cold, analytical disappointment. "Eleanor," he said, his voice calm, surgical. "You don't understand. What Celia and I have, it's a meeting of minds. A connection you and I never had." His words were precise, designed to inflict maximum damage with minimum effort. "You are the earth, Eleanor. Necessary solid. But she is the moonlight. You can't expect a man to live his whole life looking only at the dirt." His mother, Margaret, arrived soon after, summoned as reinforcement. She didn't speak of mines or moonlight. Her weapon was blunt, rural cruelty. A barren sow clinging to the pen, she'd spat at me, her finger jabbing the air near my face. "You'll drag him down with your small-town smell and your simpleton ways. You're a millstone. Have the decency to sink yourself and let him rise." They were a unified front. David with his cruel poetry, Margaret with her brutal prose. Together they engineered my exile. To ensure I left with nothing, they staged a vile pantomime. Margaret accused me of stealing a family heirloom brooch. It was found in my suitcase, of course. The scene was performed in front of a neighbor. My shame was complete, a public branding. Custody of Leo was a foregone conclusion. "What can you offer him?" David asked, not unkindly, which was worse. "A life of struggle? We can give him education, opportunities, a respected name." He was right. I was bankrupt in every currency that mattered in this new world. So I left. I returned to Oak Ridge, but I was a ghost there too. The story preceded me, twisted into a tale of my instability, my ingratitude, my theft. My parents' faces were etched with a pity that hurt more than scorn. I worked, I existed, but the vital part of me had been carved out and left on that military base. The years were a slow erosion. Letters to Leo were returned unopened. Occasional, stilted calls on his birthday were exercises in pain, his voice polite, distant, a stranger's. I heard through the ragged grapevine of our hometown when David was promoted again. When Leo graduated with honors. Each piece of news was a stone added to the cairn marking my useless life. And now, here in this cold corridor, the erosion was complete. The flame of a life poorly lived had guttered out. A voice, frayed with worry, cut through the gathering darkness. Not the darkness of death, but a different, more immediate blackness. "Eleanor, wake up." A fierce, physical shaking jolted me. It wasn't the gentle fate I'd been awaiting. It was a violent, demanding recall. I gasped, my eyes flying open. Not to the stained ceiling tiles of the hospital, but to a vast, unforgiving sky of washed-out blue. A face, young and tear-streaked, blotched with fear and snot, hovered above me. My sister, Clara. She was wearing the light blue chambray shirt I'd bought her last harvest, now faded to a soft gray from countless washes. "What's wrong with you?" she sobbed, her hands gripping my soaked shoulders. "You had a fight with your husband." "One fight. How could you just jump into the river? If you died, what would Mom and Dad do?" "What would I do?" The words washed over me, familiar yet alien. The river. The fight. The crushing weight of a letter. I turned my head, water sloshing in my ear. My body was sheathed in wet, coarse cotton, my old work dress. The smell of river mud, thick and organic, filled my nostrils. Not antiseptic. Earth. Around me was not linoleum and pale green walls, but the raw yellow dirt of the riverbank. And there, just up the path, stood the familiar weathered wooden arch that marked the entrance to Oak Ridge. A sensation wild and terrifying and glorious seized my chest. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was the sheer vertiginous shock of reversal. I wasn't dying. I was here. I was 26 again. Clara was still crying, her tears dripping onto my face, mingling with the river water. I lifted a heavy, sodden arm and touched her cheek. The feeling was electric, real. "I'm fine, Clara," I said. My voice emerged not as a weak whisper, but steady, clear, and unervingly calm to my own ears. "I just swallowed some river water. Cleared my head. Help me up. She stared, bewildered by my tone, but the instinct to obey an older sister took over. She hooked her hands under my arms and hauled me to my feet. The world swayed, then settled. I looked down at my hands, young hands strong with scraped knuckles and dirt under the nails, not the thin veined claws of my deathbed. The memory of this day crystallized with perfect, painful clarity. The letter from David had arrived 3 days prior. He'd been promoted to first lieutenant. The prose was full of pride and future plans. And then near the end, a paragraph about a remarkable new arrival at the base hospital, Celia Thorne. He wrote of her insights, her conversation about strategy and philosophy, her refreshing perspective. In my first life, a cold knot of dread had formed in my stomach, a suspicion I was too afraid to name. I'd buried it, and in a misguided attempt to prove my worth, I'd redoubled my efforts to please Margaret. Just this morning Margaret had erupted. The trigger was my failure to produce enough money for her youngest son's betrothal gift. The tirade was spectacular even for her. I was a curse, a drain, a misery bringer. She'd screamed that David must have been hexed for 8 generations to have been shackled to me. The words, combined with the secret fear the letter had planted, had been the final push. I'd run from the house, blind with a pain that felt world-ending, and thrown myself into the deep, cold pool of the Ash River. I'd been rescued, of course. And that act of weakness, that hysterical stunt, became the cornerstone of my narrative for the next 20 years. Without our David, she can't even function. She needs us to keep her stable. But now, standing on the bank, water pooling at my feet, I felt none of that world-ending pain. The grief, the desperation, the consuming love, they were ghosts. In their place was a cold, piercing clarity, hard and sharp as a diamond. Couldn't live without him? No. This time, I thought, a new, strange feeling spreading through my chilled veins. This time the ones who wouldn't know how to live would be them. Clara supported me as we trudged up the path from the river, my waterlogged dress clinging to my legs, heavy as a lead shroud. Each squelching step felt like a punctuation mark in the silent, screaming statement of my rebirth. The familiar landscape, the gnarled oak at the bend, Old Man Peterson's leaning fence, the wide, dusty lane that led to the Vance homestead, seemed both achingly real and utterly surreal, like a meticulously painted stage set. I could hear her before I saw her. Margaret Vance's voice, a saw blade of indignation, was cutting through the quiet afternoon air, coming from the direction of my parents' small farmhouse, not the Vance place. She'd taken the fight to my doorstep. What kind of daughter you raised, I'll never know. My boy is out there serving his country, putting his life on the line for folks like you, and she decides to do a swan dive into the river? Trying to shame him? To ruin his good name with her theatrics? I'm telling you plain, the Vance family wants no part of this kind of disgrace. You take your damaged goods back. We rounded the corner of the rust-red barn. There she was, planted in the middle of the yard like a malignant scarecrow, hands on her narrow hips. My father, John, stood with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, his face a mask of stoic helplessness. My mother, Helen, was weeping silently, one hand pressed to her mouth. In my first life, this scene had ended with me on my knees in the dirt, begging Margaret not to make me leave, my tears mixing with the river water still on my face, promising to be better, to try harder. The memory brought a hot wave of shame, but it was instantly quenched by the glacial calm that now resided in my core. I let go of Clara's arm and walked forward. My bare feet left damp prints in the dust. The small crowd of neighbors who had gathered, drawn by the shouting and the earlier commotion at the river, parted silently. I stopped a few feet from Margaret, ignoring my parents for now. "All right," I said. The yard went utterly silent. Even the chickens seemed to pause their scratching. Margaret's jaw, which had been working up and down like a pump handle, froze mid-word. Her beady eyes widened, then narrowed in confusion and dawning fury. "What did you just say?" she hissed. I took a slow breath, the air clean and sharp in my lungs. I said, "All right. If I'm such a disgrace, such a millstone on the illustrious Vance name, then let's be done with it. Let's get a divorce." The word hung in the air, explosive and taboo. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Divorce? In Oak Ridge? It was a scandal worse than theft, almost as bad as murder. Margaret's face flushed a mottled purple. "You dare?" she screeched, her composure shattering. "You barren, useless creature. Who do you think would want you after you've been tossed aside by a man like David? You think you can just say that word? Why wouldn't I dare? My voice was low, but it carried, every syllable edged in ice. It was your suggestion, wasn't it? Weren't you just telling the whole town how the Vance family wants no part of me? I may be a simple countrywoman, Margaret, but I understand plain English. And I still have a shred of dignity left. If your family looks down on me so thoroughly, why should I cling to you? I took a step closer and she instinctively took half a step back, which gave me a fierce, private thrill. In fact, I continued, pitching my voice for the audience, this is a relief. It saves me a lifetime of sweating in your kitchen, breaking my back in your fields, and handing over every penny I earn to feed your 2 grown sons who think work is beneath them. From now on, the money I make will be my own. That sounds much better, doesn't it? Margaret was sputtering, caught in her own trap. She'd expected wailing submission, not this cool, logical agreement that turned her vitriol against her. Why, you ungrateful wretch. You think it's that simple? You've wasted my David's best years. You'll pay for that. I allowed a smile then, thin and without warmth. Margaret, let's be precise. Did I waste his years? Or did your precious sons Roy and Billy and that daughter of yours, Susanna, waste them? Do you even know how much of his lieutenant's pay he actually sends home? Do you know how much I've scrimped and saved from my own work to add to it? Her eyes flickered with a trace of fear. I had her. I have a record, I said quietly, deadly. A notebook. Every cent David ever sent and every cent I added from selling eggs, from preserves, from taking in sewing. It's all there. And I can tell you exactly where it all went. Not into our future. Not into a home for me and Leo. It went into Roy's gambling debts last fall. It went into Billy's business ventures that never materialized. It went into the fancy fabric Susanna just had to have for a dress to impress the mayor's son. Do you want me to fetch that book right now and read the totals to everyone here? The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sallow and old. The neighbors were murmuring, their pity shifting away from the Vances and toward curiosity. I leaned in, close enough to smell the sour breath she tried to mask with peppermint. My voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. And what about the $200? The money I saved for 2 years, coin by coin, hidden in the blue tin on the top shelf? The money for my mother's operation? It went missing last spring. You were drunk on blackberry wine after Susanna's engagement party. You cried and told me you'd taken it and given it to your brother Clem to cover his farm loan. Family looks after family, you said. Imagine what David will think when he finds out his mother stole from his wife, from the mother of his child, to give to her shiftless brother. She recoiled as if struck. Her hand flew to her throat. You're lying, she choked out, but the terror in her eyes confessed the truth. Am I? I straightened up, my voice returning to its normal, clear volume. We can settle this divorce cleanly. 2 conditions. First, the money. The joint savings David and I had. That's $387.16. Gets returned to me. Not the money he sent for your support, Margaret. Our money. Every penny. I held up a second finger. Second, you will write a letter. You will state that the marriage between David and Eleanor Vance has broken down due to irreconcilable differences, and that it is the Vance family, represented by you, Margaret Vance, that is requesting the dissolution. You will sign it. You will press your thumbprint to it in ink. You will give it to me. Or what? She whispered, her bravado a brittle shell. Or, I said, the word hanging in the air like a knife. I take my little book and the story of the stolen $200, and I write it all in a letter to David. And I send a copy to his commanding officer and to the political commissar at his base. I wonder what they'll think of their upstanding Lieutenant Vance's stable home front? What happens to promotions, Margaret, when a soldier's family is accused of embezzlement and fraud? The threat landed with the force of a hammer. In that era, a soldier's moral character was inextricably linked to his family's conduct. A scandal like this wouldn't just stall David's career, it could end it. Margaret Vance deflated before my eyes. The vicious energy left her, replaced by a cold, calculating hatred. She knew she was beaten. Her own greed and her careless words had armed me. Fine, she spat, the word tasting like poison. You win, you conniving little witch. 3 days later I stood in the dusty yard once more. In one hand I held a sheet of cheap writing paper, covered in Margaret's spidery, angry script and adorned with her signature and a smudged, dark thumbprint. In the other hand, a worn cloth pouch contained $360. It was short of the full amount. She'd pleaded poverty, but it was a fortune to me. The rest, I knew, was gone forever, digested by the bottomless stomach of her family. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, tucked the letter and the money into the small satchel I'd packed, and hugged my weeping parents and a wide-eyed Claire goodbye. "Where will you go, Ellie?" my mother asked, her face etched with fresh worry. "To the base," I said, my voice firm. "To finish this." I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead for a reconciliation that was never real. I was going to file for divorce on my terms. And I was going to look David Vance and his moonlight Celia Thorne right in the eye as I did it. The train journey was a revelation. The world rushed by outside the grimy window. Fields, towns, rivers, forests. A panorama of possibility I had forgotten existed. With each mile that clacked away, a layer of the old Eleanor, the resigned martyr, seemed to flake off and blow away behind me. When I stepped off the train at the bustling station near Fort Calder, the air smelled different. Of coal smoke, engine oil and distant shouted orders. I hired a rickshaw to take me to the base, my heart not fluttering with nervous hope, but beating a steady, purposeful rhythm. The sentry at the gate checked my identification and Margaret's letter with a bored efficiency before waving me through. The compound was just as I remembered from my first catastrophic visit. Orderly, severe, humming with a masculine energy that felt both intimidating and alien. But I didn't go to the officers' quarters. I didn't go looking for David. Instead, I went to the PX and bought 2 pounds of the best almond cookies they had. Then I asked for directions to the housing reserved for the most senior officers. I walked until I found the well-kept bungalow with a small, neat garden. This was the home of Brigadier General Arthur Shaw, the base commander. His wife, Beatrice, was known among the few enlisted men's wives I'd met last time as a woman of formidable energy and surprisingly genuine kindness. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I walked up the path and knocked on the door. It opened and there she was. Beatrice Shaw was a handsome woman in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and hair swept into a no-nonsense bun. She wore a simple, elegant house dress. "Yes?" she asked, her gaze taking me in, my clean but plain traveling clothes, my determined face. "Mrs. Shaw," I said, holding out the box of cookies. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm Lieutenant David Vance's wife. From Oak Ridge." I saw the flicker of recognition and perhaps a hint of pity in her eyes. The story of the unstable rural wife had likely already made the rounds, fed by David or Margaret. "May I speak with you for a moment? I need help." Her expression softened. "Eleanor." "Of course. Come in, dear. You look like you've been through a war." That nearly broke me. The simple kindness in her voice was a weapon against which my newfound armor was suddenly thin. But I held firm. I followed her into a bright, comfortable sitting room. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Mrs. Shaw," I began, my voice carefully measured. "I'm here to end it." I placed the letter from Margaret on the coffee table between us. Then, choosing my words with the precision of a surgeon, I told her a version of the truth. I spoke of Margaret's cruelty, her demands, her theft. I spoke of David's growing distance, his letters that spoke of a world I couldn't access. I painted myself not as a vengeful harpy, but as a woman who had been pushed to the brink and had finally accepted that she was not wanted. I left out my knowledge of Celia. That card I would play later and directly. "She demanded I divorce her son," I said, a single, perfectly timed tear escaping my eye. I did not sob. "And she put it in writing. I want to do it quietly. To let David have his career, his future. I just want to take my son and go with what's rightfully mine." Beatrice Shaw's face had grown sterner with each sentence. She picked up the letter, her lips pressed into a thin line as she read Margaret's venomous words and saw the thumbprint. "This is outrageous," she said finally, her voice quiet but vibrating with anger. "Absolutely outrageous. And David? He allows this." "I believe his mother speaks for the family," I said softly, which was answer enough. She reached across and took my hand. Her grasp was warm and strong. "You poor child. You leave this with me. Arthur will know what to do. Even if divorce is the outcome, we will ensure it is done justly. You will not be wronged again under this command." That afternoon, under Beatrice Shaw's firm direction, I was installed in a spare room at the base's modest guest quarters. I waited. I didn't pace. I sat by the small window watching soldiers drill on the distant parade ground, and felt a profound, unshakable calm. As dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the storm arrived. He didn't knock. The door to my room was flung open and David Vance stood there, still in his duty uniform, his face a thundercloud of fury and humiliation. "Eleanor," he snarled, the name an accusation. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Running to the general's wife? Are you trying to destroy me?" I turned slowly from the window. I had poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the dresser. I took a slow sip, then set it down, the click of the glass on the wood the only sound in the room besides his ragged breathing. "Destroy you," I repeated, my voice flat. "I'm following your mother's direct orders, David. I'm here to finalize the divorce paperwork she demanded. I'm trying to leave your life as cleanly as possible. Isn't that what you all want?" He strode into the room, tugging at his stiff collar. My mother was angry. She didn't mean it. "Why can't you just stay in Oak Ridge and be quiet? Why do you have to bring your dramas here?" I finally looked at him directly, meeting the eyes of the man for whom I had once burned my own dreams to ash. There was no love there anymore, not even hurt. Just a cold, analytical assessment. He was handsome, certainly. The uniform gave him an authority that was undeniable. But I saw the petulance around his mouth, the entitlement in his stance. "So in your view," I said, taking a step toward him, "my role is to stay in the dirt, serving your family, waiting silently until you decide my usefulness is over? And then to disappear without a sound when your moonlight appears." His head jerked back as if I'd slapped him. The color drained from his face, then flooded back in a dark red. "What did you say?" "Celia Thorne," I said, the name hanging in the air between us like a cobra ready to strike. "The physiotherapist. The one you meet in the birch grove behind the commissary. The one you discuss philosophy and higher things with. The one whose hand you hold." His bravado shattered. Panic, raw and undisguised, flashed in his eyes. You followed me? You spied on me?" A cold, mirthless laugh escaped me. "I don't need to spy. If you don't want to be seen, David, don't do it in a public grove in the middle of the day. You're already a joke among the junior officers' wives. They pity me. They laugh at you." It was a calculated blow and it landed perfectly. His career, his reputation, they were his idols. The thought of being a laughingstock was worse than any marital discord. "Eleanor, listen," he said, his voice dropping, shifting to a placating tone that once would have melted me. "Celia and I were colleagues. Friends. It's a meeting of minds, that's all." "A meeting of minds," I echoed, my voice dripping with scorn. "Spare me the poetry, David. I've had enough of your pretty lies to last a lifetime." I walked to the bed where my satchel lay. I pulled out the divorce papers Beatrice Shaw had helped me prepare that afternoon. I slapped them down on the small table. "Sign them. I don't want the apartment. I don't want your medals. I don't want a single thing from your glorious future." I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I only want my son." The moment I said it, the air in the small room crystallized. "I only want my son." David's face, which had been a shifting canvas of anger, panic, and attempted manipulation, hardened into a mask of cold resistance. In my first life, Leo had been the chain that bound me to him long after the marriage was dead. A tool for control, a source of endless, exquisite pain. He knew that. And he assumed the same lever would work now. "Impossible," he stated, his voice flat, final. "Leo is a Vance. He stays with his family. With me." The old fear, the primal terror of being separated from my child, tried to rise in my throat. I choked it down, letting it fuel my resolve instead of my fear. "With you?" I asked, my voice deceptively soft. "So you can teach him what, exactly? How to abandon the people who sacrifice for him. How to trade loyalty for convenience. How to become a man of rank but no honor." He flinched, but his jaw remained set. "I am his father. I can give him opportunities you can't even imagine. A proper education. The future. You'd keep him in some backwater with no prospects." I didn't argue. I simply laid out the new reality. "David Vance, you have two choices." I held up one finger. "First, you sign these papers. We divorce quietly, amicably. I take Leo. I will tell anyone who asks that we grew apart, that it was a mutual decision. Your reputation as the upstanding Lieutenant Vance remains spotless. Your path to captain and beyond is clear. I paused, letting the allure of that clean, easy path sink in. I saw the temptation flicker in his eyes, the easy way out with his precious career intact. Then I raised a second finger. Or, I continued, each word a drop of ice. I take what I know. The dates, the times, the specific location of the birch grove, the testimony of the wives who've seen you, and I walk it straight to the office of the base's disciplinary committee. You know the regulations on adultery better than I do, Lieutenant. What is the punishment for an officer who compromises his integrity and the sanctity of his home? When that happens, you can forget about your future. You'll be lucky to keep the uniform on your back. His hand shot out, fingers closing like a vice around my wrist. The grip was painful, meant to intimidate. You wouldn't dare. I didn't pull away. I didn't wince. I just looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up into his eyes. My gaze was empty, a still pond reflecting his own mounting dread. Try me. We stood locked in that terrible silence, a battle of wills fought in the space between heartbeats. I could feel the pulse hammering in his thumb where it pressed against my skin. I saw the calculations racing behind his eyes. The risk assessment of a military man. The evidence I had was circumstantial, but it was ammunition. In the hypermoral atmosphere of the command, with the general's wife already sympathetic to me, it would be enough to trigger an inquiry. An inquiry was a stain. A stain was a death sentence for ambition. His fingers loosened, then fell away. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping in a posture of defeat that was more humiliating than any anger. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a seething, impotent resentment. He knew I held the knife, and it was poised at the jugular of his life's work. Fine, he spat, the word gritted out between clenched teeth. Leo stays with you. But you leave. Today. And you never come back here. You don't contact me. You stay out of my life. A wave of such profound relief washed through me that my knees nearly buckled. I kept my expression neutral. Nothing would please me more. I picked up the pen from the table, offered it to him. He snatched it, scrawled his name on the divorce papers with a violent slash of ink. I signed my own name beside his, my hand steady. The signature, Eleanor Vance, felt like the closing of a tomb. And the opening of a gate. The process that followed was surreal in its efficiency, lubricated by the quiet, firm pressure from General Shaw's office. David, desperate to be rid of the living reminder of his miscalculation, even produced $500. A settlement, he called it, though we both knew it was hush money, a payment to ensure my swift and permanent disappearance. 2 days later, I stood at the gates of Fort Calder for what I knew would be the last time. In my arms, I held 4-year-old Leo, who was confused but quietly excited about a trip. He clutched a small wooden soldier his father had given him in a moment of perfunctory farewell. In my satchel was the divorce decree, the money, and a single small photograph of my parents. I did not look back at the gray barracks, at the flag snapping in the wind, at the world that had tried to grind me into nothing. My gaze was fixed ahead, down the long road that led to the train station, and to a future I now had to invent from scratch. The whispers followed us, of course. I felt them like a chill breeze. Poor woman. What will she do now? A divorcee with a child. Her life is over. I knew David believed them. He was certain that within months, the harsh world would break me, and I'd come crawling back, granting him the final victory of my surrender. He could not have been more wrong. I did not return to Oak Ridge, to the pity and the lingering shadow of the Vances. Nor did I go to my parents' farm to become another burden on their stooped shoulders. Instead, with Leo's small hand in mine, I boarded a train heading in the opposite direction of my past, north to the bustling provincial capital of Meridian. The 1980s were stirring. You could feel it in the air, a restless energy humming under the surface of the planned economy. Private enterprise was a timid green shoot, but it was pushing through the cracks in the pavement. And I had memories, not of markets and trends but of hunger. In my first destitute life, I'd eventually found work in a massive factory canteen in a southern city. I'd learned how to feed thousands on a budget, but I'd also tasted once the dish created by the head chef for the visiting officials. Dumplings. Not the sturdy, cabbage-heavy ones of the north, but delicate, translucent parcels filled with a savory sweet mixture of pork, shrimp, and bamboo shoots. The memory of that flavor had haunted me. It was a taste of a different world. That was my plan. Not a factory. Not a shop. Food. Using a portion of the settlement money, I rented a tiny, narrow storefront in the oldest part of Meridian. It was on a street sandwiched between 3 sprawling state-owned textile mills. The building was grimy, the paint peeling, but the location was perfect. A river of thousands of workers flowed past its door twice a day, hungry and in a hurry. I scrubbed the place until my hands were raw. I whitewashed the walls. I found a discarded wooden crate, sanded it smooth, and with Clara's help, she had insisted on joining me, a fierce, loyal ally. I painted a name in careful, bold letters, Allie's Plate. I would start with dumplings. But my dumplings. I adapted that remembered southern recipe, making the filling heartier with more pork and adding finely chopped water chestnuts for a northern crunch. I perfected a dough that was sturdy enough to survive a quick boil yet tender to the bite. And my secret, the cornerstone, was the broth. While the city slept, I'd simmer giant pots of pork bones and chicken carcasses, skimming diligently, letting it reduce to a rich, milky nectar. That broth, given away free with every order, would be my siren's call. Opening day dawned clear and cold. I was a knot of nerves. Leo, bless him, sat on a stool behind the counter with a coloring book, a model of solemn 4-year-old responsibility. Clara manned the tiny cash box. I lit the burners under the broth pots. The aroma, deep and savory and promising warmth, began to drift out the open door. It took 15 minutes. The first worker, a burly man with grease under his fingernails, paused mid-stride, his nose lifting like a hound's. He peered in. "What's that smell?" "Lunch," I said, smiling. "Pork and water chestnut dumplings. Free broth with a bowl. Want to try?" He did. He ate the first bowl standing up, then sat down and ordered a second. By noon there was a line stretching out the door. The workers were tired, hungry, and had little money for extravagance. My food was hot, filling, delicious, and crucially cheap. The word spread through the mills like wildfire. "Miss Ellie," a young woman said, her face glowing from the steam of her bowl, "this broth is better than my grandmother's. How do you do it?" I just smiled. A long night and a careful eye. The first week was a blur of exhausting, exhilarating triumph. My hands ached from folding dumplings, my feet throbbed, but my heart sang. Every coin in the cash box was mine, earned by my own skill and sweat. Leo would fall asleep on a pallet of empty flour sacks in the back room, lulled by the rhythmic chop of my knife. But success, as I was to learn quickly, casts a shadow. They showed up a month later as the autumn leaves began to turn. 3 men with the casual swagger of predators. They didn't look like mill workers. Their clothes were cheaper imitations of city style, worn with a deliberate carelessness meant to intimidate. The leader, a thin man with a pencil mustache, leaned on my counter. "Nice little place you got here, sister." "Busy. Must be doing all right." "We get by," I said, wiping my hands on my apron, my pulse kicking up a notch. "Getting by is good. Staying in business is better." He smiled, revealing a gold-capped tooth. "This neighborhood, it can be tricky. Fires. Break-ins. Rat problems. You wouldn't believe the rat problems. Lucky for you, we provide a protection service. Keep the troubles away. Let's say 20% of your weekly take. For peace of mind." The old Eleanor would have frozen, would have stammered, would have felt the world closing in. The new Eleanor looked at him, at the cheap menace in his eyes, and felt a cold, calculating anger. I had not clawed my way out of one trap to walk into another. 20% is a lot for a small business just finding its feet, I said, my voice politely neutral. "Why don't you gentlemen sit down? Have a bowl of dumplings on the house. It's the lunch rush. Let me get my customers sorted and we can talk about your service later this afternoon." They exchanged glances, surprised by the offer. Free food was free food. The leader shrugged. "All right, sister. We're reasonable men. We'll have a taste of your famous dumplings." I served them myself. 3 heaping bowls of my best pork and water chestnut. But as I'd prepared the filling that morning, I'd added a special ingredient. Not poison. Nothing illegal. It was a wild herb my grandmother had called itchweed, something we used in poultices for deep bruises. Ingested, it was harmless, but for one notable effect. About 12 hours later, it caused an intense, maddening full-body rash and itching that lasted for a day. No doctor could trace it to a source. It just looked like a vicious allergic reaction. They ate with gusto, complimenting the food. I smiled, thanked them, and said I'd have their answer about the money tomorrow. The next morning I had $100 in an envelope, a bitter pill I was prepared to swallow. But the men who arrived at my door weren't the thugs. It was 2 police officers. Miss Vance? We understand there was an attempt to extort money from this establishment. I feigned wide-eyed surprise. Extort? Oh, those men yesterday. They just had some lunch. They said they'd be back today to discuss a business proposal. The older officer exchanged a wry look with his partner. They won't be discussing anything for a while. The 3 of them showed up at the emergency room at 4 a.m., scratching themselves raw. Convinced they had some rare plague. Started confessing to all sorts of things: protection rackets, burglaries, vandalism, begging for a doctor to make the itching stop and promising to reform. He shook his head, a hint of a smile on his lips. Seems they had a sudden attack of conscience. Or a very bad reaction to something. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I looked at him with perfect, guileless innocence. Officer, I just make dumplings. The story of the thugs who tried to shake down Ellie's plate and ended up in custody, confessing through their misery, spread even faster than the praise for my broth. A new layer was added to my reputation. Ellie Vance was not just a good cook, she was not to be trifled with. The business didn't just grow, it multiplied. Within a year I rented the vacant storefront next door, knocked through the wall, and Ellie's plate became Ellie's hearth, with tables, a longer menu featuring braised dishes and simple stir-fries, and Clara as my fiercely competent manager. I bought a house. Not just any house. A proper 2-story brick home with a small, walled garden, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where doctors and engineers lived. I brought my parents from Oak Ridge to live with me. My father tended a magnificent vegetable plot in the garden. My mother's laughter once again filled the rooms. Clara blossomed, her natural organizational talent making her the engine of our expansion. My life was a universe removed from the cold cot, the glass shard pane, the photograph of a lost son. I was Eleanor Vance, business owner. A woman who had built something from nothing. And through the ragged grapevine of hometown connections and occasional visits from soldiers on leave, I heard the echoes of the world I'd left behind. David had married Celia Thorne within a year of our divorce. The reports were not of bliss. Celia, it was said, was a creature of salon comforts, not a builder of homes. David often returned from exercises to a cold house and a wife more interested in discussing officer wives' club politics than making dinner. Margaret Vance had, predictably, tried to exert her dominion. Celia, with her big city connections and a father who was a senior administrator, had simply made a phone call. A word from the right person to David's commanding officer about interfering, troublesome family members had silenced Margaret more effectively than any argument I ever made. The mighty Margaret was now, by all accounts, a sullen, resentful occasional babysitter in her son's home. They said David had become harder, more bitter. His rise had stalled at major. He drank a little too much at officer functions. And when he heard, as he inevitably did, that the ex-wife he'd cast off was now Ellie of Ellie's Hearth, a self-made success in the provincial capital, the news reportedly sent him into a week of black, silent fury. I felt nothing when I heard this. It was like hearing a weather report from a country I'd never visit. Until the day a battered, familiar sedan pulled up outside my gate. I was in the garden showing Leo how to prune the rose bushes. He was 8 now, bright and curious, doing well in a good school. He called my parents Nana and Granddad. He barely remembered his father. The wailing started before I saw them. A theatrical, ragged sob. Then Margaret Vance stumbled into view, followed by a grim-faced David. He looked older, heavier around the middle, his uniform crisp but somehow hanging on him without the old pride. Eleanor. Oh, Eleanor, my girl. Margaret cried, reaching for me with trembling, dramatic hands. Look at you. Look at all this. We were wrong, so wrong. David stood behind her, his eyes taking in the prosperous house, the tidy garden, my son, well-dressed, clean, happy, standing beside me. His expression was a storm of regret, humiliation, and a desperate, calculating hope. Ellie, he said, his voice rough. I've been a fool. A blind, prideful fool. Can you ever forgive me? Look at our son. He needs his father. A boy needs a complete family. Leo looked up at me confused, then at the strange man claiming him. He moved closer to my side. I felt no rage. Only a vast, weary contempt. I signaled to Clara, who had come to the door. She opened the garden gate wide, letting the neighbors who had begun to gather see the spectacle. I put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "You see this man, Leo?" I said, my voice clear and calm, carrying in the quiet street. "He is your biological father. And he is a lesson. A lesson that titles and uniforms don't make a man. Honor, integrity, and keeping your word do." I turned my gaze to David, then to Margaret, whose tears had dried up into a look of sheer, venomous hatred. Major Vance wanted moonlight. And he got it. I am just a businesswoman, soil under my nails, making an honest living. I wouldn't dream of soiling your refined world with my presence. I looked at David, my eyes as cold as the ash river the day I was reborn. My son has everything he needs. He has a family that loves him. He does not need a father who only remembers he exists when that father's own dreams have turned to dust. Now, please get off my property before I call the police and have you removed for causing a disturbance. The slam of the garden gate was the period at the end of the sentence of my old life. As the lock clicked shut, I felt the last ghost of Eleanor the martyr, Eleanor the victim, dissolve into the sunlit air. I was free. Truly, completely free. But fate, it seemed, was not quite finished with me. It had one last, utterly unexpected turn in store. The finality of the slamming gate echoed not just in the garden, but in the very marrow of my being. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated closure. The wailing and subsequent furious sputtering of Margaret and David faded as Clara firmly guided them away from the property line, a look of fierce satisfaction on her face. Leo, after a moment of thoughtful silence, simply shrugged and went back to his roses, the strange interruption already forgotten in the way only a child's world can reshape itself. I stood there, breathing in the scent of damp earth and blossoms, feeling a lightness I hadn't known was possible. The battle was over. I had won. Not just the divorce or the business, but the deeper war for my own soul. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me but by what I had built. The years that followed were a period of rich, steady growth, not just for Ellie's hearth but for all of us. The restaurant expanded again, becoming a cornerstone of the Meridian dining scene. We added a second location across the city. Clara, my brilliant sister, ran the original with an iron fist in a velvet glove, freeing me to plan, to experiment, to be the visionary rather than just the laborer. My parents thrived in the peace of their later years, their faces losing the deep lines of worry that had been etched by my first disastrous marriage. Leo was the greatest joy. He was smart, kind, and possessed a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was unconditionally loved and supported. He asked about his father occasionally with a detached curiosity, and I answered honestly but without venom. David Vance was a fact of history, not a character in our present. I assumed that was the end of our connection, that the slammed gate was the final page in the book of the Vances. My life was full, challenging, and happy. I had no room for ghosts. Fate, however, has a mischievous sense of irony. It was a humid, early summer afternoon. Leo, now 10 and full of boundless energy, was playing tag with the neighbors' children in the communal park behind our row of houses. I was sitting on a bench, going over supply lists for the new restaurant, half watching them dash and shriek with the sheer joy of it. I heard the shout, a sharp cry of surprise rather than pain, but my mother's instincts were a lightning strike. I looked up just in time to see Leo trip over an exposed tree root and pitch forward, his momentum carrying him headfirst into the unforgiving granite corner of a raised flower bed. The sound was a sickening thud. Then silence. For a heart-stopping second he didn't move. Then he let out a weak, confused cry and I was already running. By the time I reached him, blood was welling from a deep gash on his forehead, a shocking crimson against his pale skin. It streamed down his temple into his eye. "Mom," he whimpered, his eyes wide with shock. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," I chanted, my voice trembling despite my resolve. I yanked off my light cardigan, pressing it firmly against the wound. "Clara!" I screamed towards the house. "Clara now!" What followed was a blur of terror and motion. Clara came sprinting. We bundled Leo into the car, my mother shrieking from the doorway. I drove with a calm I didn't feel, every red light an eternity, to the nearest hospital, which happened to be Meridian Central Military Hospital, the largest and best equipped in the city. The emergency room was a cacophony of controlled panic. Nurses descended on Leo, whisking him onto a gurney. A doctor with a calm demeanor asked rapid-fire questions as they wheeled him away for assessment and stitches. I was left standing in the stark, brightly lit corridor, my hands stained with my son's blood, my cardigan a ruined, scarlet bundle in my grip. I was shaking, the delayed shock setting in. I leaned against the cool wall, trying to breathe to anchor myself. The smell of antiseptic was overwhelming, a scent that for a split second transported me back to the cold corridor of my death. I pushed the memory away violently. Not now. Not here. A sudden, brisk movement to my side made me flinch. A man in a crisp, high-ranking officer's uniform was striding down the corridor, followed by a young aide. They were moving with purpose, and the aide, glancing down at a clipboard, didn't see me pressed against the wall. He brushed against my shoulder, jostling me. "Oh. I beg your pardon, ma'am," the young man said immediately, snapping to attention almost, his face flushed with apology. "It's fine," I murmured automatically, my eyes fixed on the doors through which they'd taken Leo. The officer leading him had stopped. He turned and his gaze fell upon me. He was older than David, perhaps in his early 50s, with steel-gray hair cut close and a face that was both severe and intelligent. The stars and insignia on his shoulders marked him as someone very senior. But it wasn't the rank I noticed first, it was his eyes. They were a steady, deep blue, and they took in the scene. The blood on my hands, the fear on my face, the way I was clinging to the wall, with a sharp, assessing calm that held no pity, only understanding. He seemed on the verge of speaking, his lips parting slightly. For a surreal moment our eyes held. In his, I saw no judgment of my disheveled state, only a quiet, professional concern. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of shared humanity in the midst of crisis, before turning and continuing down the hall, his aides scurrying after him. The moment was so brief, so strange amidst the panic, that I filed it away as a fragment of surreal hospital drama. My entire being was focused on the door to the treatment rooms. When a nurse finally emerged to tell me Leo would need stitches but was fine, no concussion, the relief that washed over me was so profound my legs gave way. I slid down the wall to the floor, finally allowing myself to cry, tears of sheer, unadulterated release. A week later, with Leo sporting a neat line of stitches and a pirate-worthy story, I took him back to the park. He was under strict orders not to run, so we brought a kite, a magnificent dragon of red and gold silk. The breeze was perfect, and soon the dragon was soaring, Leo whooping with delight as he let out the string. Then the string snagged. A gust twisted it around the branch of a tall maple. Leo groaned. "No. Mom, it's stuck." "Here, let me try," a calm masculine voice said from behind us. I turned. It was him. The officer from the hospital corridor. But today he was out of uniform. He wore simple, well-tailored trousers and a light gray sweater. Beside him, holding a butterfly kite that lay dormant on the grass, was a little girl with serious eyes and two neat braids. She looked to be about Leo's age. "Allow me," he said, and before I could protest, he had shimmied up the lower branches of the maple with a surprising agile strength for a man his age. In moments he had disentangled the string and tossed the end down to Leo. "Thank you, sir," Leo said, beaming. "My pleasure." The man dropped lightly to the ground, dusting his hands. His eyes met mine again, and this time, there was a hint of a smile in them. "We meet again. Under much better circumstances, I see." He glanced at Leo's forehead. "The patient appears to have made a full recovery." "Thanks to your hospital," I said, finding my voice. "I'm Eleanor Vance. This is my son Leo." "Leonard Gray," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, warm. "And this is my daughter Kate." Kate gave a shy smile. Leo, never one for shyness, immediately asked if she wanted to fly her kite. Within minutes, the two children were running at a careful jog in Leo's case. Across the grass, their kites dancing in tandem against the blue sky. "She doesn't get to play with other children often," Leonard Gray said quietly, watching them. "Her mother passed away 3 years ago. I'm afraid my world is not particularly designed for playdates." The simple confession, offered without a hint of self-pity, disarmed me. "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded, accepting the condolence. "And you? Your husband?" He left the question hanging, his gaze tactful. "Divorced," I said the word now easy weightless. A long time ago. Ah. He was silent for a moment watching the children. Ellie's hearth, he said suddenly. I blinked. I'm sorry. Your restaurant. Ellie's hearth. On Oak Street. My adjutant brought me takeout once when I was working late. The braised pork belly. He looked at me and the hint of a smile returned. It was exceptional. I've been meaning to visit in person. I felt an unexpected flush of pride, one that had nothing to do with the flattery of a high-ranking officer, and everything to do with the recognition of my craft. Thank you. It's my recipe. I don't doubt it. He turned fully to face me, his posture relaxed but his attention complete. A woman who builds a business like that from the ground up while raising a son alone. That is a different kind of service. A different kind of courage. I was struck silent. In both of my lives, no man had ever spoken to me like that. Not as a helpmeet, not as a possession, not as a symbol of rustic simplicity or spiritual lack. He saw the work. He respected the achievement. The feeling it sparked in my chest was foreign and warm. That afternoon in the park was the first thread. Leonard. Leo, as he asked me to call him, which made my own Leo laugh with delight, began to appear in my life with a gentle, persistent regularity. He would bring Kate to the park on weekends. Sometimes they would just happen to walk past Ellie's hearth and stop in for a meal. He was a quiet presence, never imposing but always solid. He asked thoughtful questions about my business, listened to my ideas with genuine interest. He treated Clara with respect, charmed my parents with his old-fashioned manners, and with Leo he was a revelation. Patient, firm, and endlessly interesting, teaching him chess, explaining the history behind the monuments in the city square, treating his thoughts with a seriousness most adults reserved for each other. Clara teased me mercilessly. A general, Ellie. You're going to be a general's wife. And after you swore off military men for life. I laughed it off, but the warmth in my heart was becoming a steady flame. I had built a fortress around my life, a fortress of independence and success. Leonard Gray wasn't trying to storm the walls. He was being invited, slowly and carefully, across the drawbridge. The day he proposed there was no grand gesture. It was a Tuesday evening. The restaurant was closed. We were in the garden of my home, the one where I'd once confronted David. The roses were in bloom. Leonard had helped me weed the vegetable patch earlier. Eleanor, he said, putting down his trowel and wiping his hands on his trousers. He didn't get down on one knee. He simply looked at me, his blue eyes clear and steady in the twilight. I can't offer you a life of idle luxury. My career is one of duty, and it will always come first after my children. Both Kate and, if you'll allow me, Leo. But what I can offer is this. My absolute respect. My unwavering support. A partnership between equals. And a shoulder you can always lean on, as I hope you will allow me to lean on yours. He took a breath. Will you marry me? Tears filled my eyes, but they were tears of joy, not of pain or memory. I looked at this good man who saw me for who I was and valued me for it. I looked at our children laughing together by the fish pond. I looked at the life I had built, strong and whole, and realized he wasn't here to complete it but to share it. Yes, I said, my voice thick. Yes, Leo, I will. Our wedding was small, simple, and perfect. Only family and a few close friends. My parents wept happy tears. Clara was my beaming maid of honor. Leo and Kate, now the best of friends, carried the rings. Afterward my life changed, yet it didn't. Leonard never asked me to give up Ellie's hearth. On the contrary, he used his logistical knowledge to help me streamline my supply chains, connecting me with reputable wholesalers. With his quiet backing, the stigma of being a mere businesswoman in certain circles evaporated. Ellie's hearth became a small empire, and I became not just a successful restaurateur, but Mrs. Eleanor Gray. The peace was profound. The past was a closed book. I believed our story had reached its gentle, satisfying conclusion. I was wrong. The letter arrived on official stationery. Leonard brought it home one evening, his expression thoughtful. He passed it to me across the dinner table. It's a transfer, he said calmly. A promotion, effectively. They're creating a new consolidated military district in the south, merging 3 smaller commands. They want me to take command. Pride swelled in my chest. That's wonderful, Leo. That's a huge responsibility. It is, he agreed. Then he paused. The headquarters for the new district. It's at Fort Sentinel. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then I saw the slight tension around his eyes. Fort Sentinel. The pieces clicked into place with an almost audible snap. It was the larger modernized base that had absorbed Fort Calder. David's last posting. The wheels of fate, it seemed, turned with a sense of poetic cruelty that took my breath away. Leonard knew the outline of my past. I had told him about David, about the divorce. He took my hand. We don't have to go. I can refuse the posting. They'll give it to someone else. I looked at his hand covering mine. I looked at our children now bickering playfully over the last dumpling. I thought of the woman I had been and the woman I was now. No, I said, my voice firm. A strange, calm certainty settled over me. We'll go. You earned this command. And I smiled a real smile. I have no fear of ghosts. Let's go home. Fort Sentinel was a different beast entirely from the cramped concrete world of Fort Calder. It sprawled across rolling hills, a meticulously planned city in olive drab. The headquarters was a modern glass and steel structure, and the commanding officer's residence was not an apartment, but a spacious two-story colonial-style house with a wide porch and a view over the parade grounds. It came with a gardener and a cook, both provided by the army. Standing on the porch that first evening, watching the sunset paint the barracks in hues of rose and gold, I felt a surreal detachment. The air here was the same, a blend of cut grass, diesel and disciplined purpose, but I was breathing it from an entirely new altitude. The last time I had been on a base like this, I had been an unwelcome supplicant, my worth measured and found wanting. Now I was the commander's wife. Leonard squeezed my shoulder. All right. More than all right, I said, leaning into his touch. It feels like a very strange dream. He chuckled. For me too. But a good one. The children were ecstatic with the size of the house and the newness of everything. Kate, now almost 11, adopted a proprietary air, showing Leo, my Leo now 12, all the secret spots she'd already discovered. Our life began to knit itself into the fabric of the new post. I made inquiries about commercial spaces, planning to open a southern branch of Ellie's Hearth. Leonard was buried in the work of merging 3 commands, his days long and filled with meetings. I had no intention of seeking out David Vance. He was a relic, a fossil from a previous geological era of my life. The past held no power over me here. But the military is a small world, and rank has a way of making one the center of attention. The official welcoming reception for the new district commander was held in the officers' club ballroom. I wore a simple but elegant navy dress. Leonard looked formidable in his full dress uniform, a galaxy of stars and medals on his chest. We moved through the crowd, Leonard introducing me to a blur of colonels, their wives, local dignitaries. I smiled, shook hands, made polite conversation about the climate and the schools. I felt the stare before I saw him. It was a prickling on the back of my neck, a cold spot in the warm room. I turned my head slightly. There, across the room, partially obscured by a group of junior officers, stood David. He was in uniform, the oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel on his shoulders. He had finally made it. He looked heavier, his face set in lines of permanent dissatisfaction. His eyes were fixed on me, wide with a shock so profound it looked like physical pain. Then his gaze flicked to Leonard, to the insignia of command, and his face drained of all color. He looked as if he'd been gut-punched. Our eyes met for one frozen second. In his, I saw the collapse of a worldview, the bewildered fury, the dizzying humiliation, the sheer impossible wrongness of the scene. The woman he'd discarded as worthless was on the arm of the man who now held his entire career in his hands. I held his gaze for a beat longer, my expression one of polite, distant recognition, the way one might look at a vaguely familiar acquaintance. Then I turned back to the mayor's wife and resumed our conversation about rose varieties, a small, serene smile on my lips. I didn't see him for the rest of the evening. I learned later he'd left almost immediately. The machinery of the new command ground on, impartial and relentless. I was busy, setting up our new home, exploring the town with an eye for a restaurant location, navigating the complex social ecosystem of the senior officers' wives. Beatrice Shaw had given me a crash course before I left, and I found myself grateful for her tutelage. I was friendly but reserved, kind but not familiar. I was Mrs. Gray, and that was armor enough. David, I gathered through the efficient gossip network that as any military base was not faring as well. The consolidation had left many officers jockeying for position. His promotion to lieutenant colonel, once the pinnacle of his ambition, now seemed a stagnant backwater. Rumor had it his marriage to Celia was a cold, quiet war of attrition. She was reportedly bored by Fort Sentinel, finding it provincial compared to her previous postings. And his mother, Margaret, was a rare visitor, the memory of her humiliation by Celia's family still too raw. He was, by all accounts, a man trapped in a life that had turned to ashes in his mouth. And I, the ghost of his past, was now the unassailable queen of his professional world. The irony was so perfect it was almost literary. I thought that was the extent of it, a silent, brutal justice delivered by circumstance. I was wrong again. The summons came to Leonard's office, not mine. His aide, a sharp young captain named Davis, appeared at our door one evening just after dinner. "Sir, apologies for the intrusion. There's an issue at headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Vance is insisting on seeing you tonight. He's rather agitated. The duty officer thought you should be informed." Leonard's eyebrows rose. He looked at me. I kept my face carefully neutral, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. This was it. The past wasn't content to be a spectator. It wanted a confrontation. "I'll handle it," Leonard said, rising. He kissed my forehead. "Don't wait up." But I couldn't sleep. I paced the living room, imagining the scene in Leonard's office. David, desperate, angry, perhaps drunk, making accusations, demanding what? Recognition? An apology? A demolition of the reality that so offended him? Leonard returned 2 hours later. He looked tired and a deep sadness clouded his eyes. He poured himself a small brandy and sat down heavily in his armchair. "Well?" I finally asked, unable to bear the silence. "He's requested a transfer," Leonard said, his voice flat. "Immediate. To any posting, no matter how remote." I blinked. "That's all." Leonard swirled the brandy in his glass. "Not quite." He spent the first 20 minutes in a rambling, barely coherent monologue. About betrayal. About being sabotaged. About how she, meaning you, had plotted to ruin him from the beginning. He looked at me, his gaze searching. "He said you'd trapped him into the divorce, that you'd always been cunning, that you'd used his mother's temper against him. He implied our marriage was some kind of long-con revenge scheme." A laugh, sharp and bitter, escaped me. "He thinks I orchestrated this?" I gestured around at the house at him. "That I somehow masterminded becoming the wife of a general 10 years in the future, just to spite him?" "The logic of a crumbling ego is not sound logic, Eleanor," Leonard said softly. He took a sip. The more he talked, the more the rage bled out and the emptiness showed. "He's a broken man. Not by you. By his own choices, his own character. He looked at what he threw away and saw what it became, and he can't live with the reflection." I sat down, the fight going out of me. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, weary pity. "What did you tell him?" "I told him his personal history with you was not, and never would be, a matter for my command consideration," Leonard said, his voice taking on the steel of his rank. "I told him his performance reports from his previous CO were middling, citing a lack of initiative and difficulty working within a team, issues that predated my arrival or your presence here. I told him a transfer was possible, but it would be processed through normal channels, based on the needs of the service and his documented record. Not as an escape hatch." He finished his brandy. He left looking like a man headed for the gallows. The official request for transfer landed on Leonard's desk the next morning. Leonard, true to his word, processed it with impersonal efficiency. The army, in its glacial wisdom, took 3 months to respond. David Vance was reassigned to a logistical supply depot in a remote, frigid northern province, a posting notorious as a career graveyard. The news spread through Fort Sentinel. It was seen as a clear demotion, a quiet dismissal. I heard that Celia Thorne Vance refused to go. A bitter, final divorce was rumored. Margaret, it was said, had taken to her bed in Oak Ridge, a shrill, defeated invalid. The day before his departure, I was in town, finalizing the lease on a perfect little space for Ellie's hearth south. I was walking back to my car, my mind full of floor plans and menus, when I saw him. He was coming out of the post office, a box of his personal effects in his arms. He looked shrunken in his uniform, a man playing dress-up. He saw me and stopped dead. There was no crowd this time. No gate to slam. Just the two of us on a quiet, sun-drenched street. For a long moment we just looked at each other. The handsome young lieutenant, the ambitious captain, the cruel husband, they were all gone. In his place was a middle-aged man with defeat in his shoulders and the sour knowledge that he had been the architect of his own ruin. I felt nothing. No hate. No pity. Not even satisfaction. He was simply a stranger. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, to curse, to beg. But no sound came out. What was there left to say? I gave him a small, polite nod, the barest acknowledgement of a shared history now so remote it might have happened to other people. Then I turned, unlocked my car and got in. As I drove away I saw him in the rearview mirror, still standing on the sidewalk holding his box, utterly alone. That was the last time I ever saw David Vance. The northern branch of Ellie's Hearth opened to lines around the block. It seemed the entire base was curious to taste the cooking of the general's wife. They came for the gossip, but they returned for the braised pork belly and the delicate shrimp dumplings. Soon it was simply the best restaurant in town and I was simply its owner. The whispers about my past faded, replaced by respect for my present. Life on Fort Sentinel settled into a rich, fulfilling rhythm. Leonard's command was a success, bringing order and renewed purpose to the consolidated district. He was respected, even beloved, by his troops for his fairness and his unwavering focus on their welfare. At home he was a devoted father and a partner in the truest sense. We were a team. Leo blossomed under Leonard's steady guidance. He talked of becoming an engineer, of building things. Kate, who had started calling me Mom Eleanor, lost her shyness, becoming a leader among her friends. Our family was a happy, noisy, loving mosaic. One golden autumn afternoon years after David's departure, I was in the garden of the commanding officer's residence. My parents were visiting, sitting in rocking chairs on the porch, watching Leonard teach both children how to split firewood with precise, safe strokes. Clara was on extended leave, traveling down the coast with a handsome engineer she'd met. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. I was cutting the last of the season's roses, their scent deep and spicy. As I placed them in a basket, my hand brushed against a particularly thorny stem. A sharp prick, a bead of blood welling on my thumb. I didn't gasp. I just looked at it, the vivid red against my skin. It brought no memory of panic, of Leo's blood on my hands in the hospital. It was just a thorn prick. A small pain in a life now so full of quiet joy it sometimes felt like a dream. I looked up at the scene before me. My husband strong and kind. Our children laughing and learning. My parents content and peaceful. The beautiful house, the successful business, the hard-won respect. The sharp, glass-like pain that had scraped across my lungs in a cold corridor a lifetime ago was gone. Not just forgotten but healed. The love I had poured into a void for so long had been replanted, and it had grown into this. A harvest so abundant I could never have imagined it. I had come back for revenge, I thought. To make them pay. To live well is the best revenge. But I realized, standing there with a drop of blood on my thumb and the sun warming my face, that I had been wrong. Revenge was a petty, small-minded goal. It was a shadow. What I had truly come back for was not to fight them but to stop fighting for them. To reclaim the energy, the love, the very life that I had wasted on people who didn't value it. I had taken that reclaimed life and invested it in myself, in my son, in my family, in my work. The Vances of the world. The Davids, the Margarets, the Celius, they were prisoners of their own smallness. Their punishment was not my success, but their own eternal, bitter confinement in the tiny cells of their own making. I was free. I had not just left the cage, I had built a kingdom in the world outside it. Leonard looked over, saw me standing still and smiled. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Gray." I smiled back, wiping the blood on my apron. "I was just thinking," I said, my voice clear and full in the autumn air, "how very lucky I am." And I meant it. Not as a platitude but as the deepest, most profound truth of my two lives. The first life had taught me the cost of surrender. The second life had taught me the incalculable value of the fight. The fight was over. Now there was only life. And it was sweeter than I had ever dared to dream. The end.